I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
When we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
Foundations of society are fragile. We must be the shepherds of our own civilization.
Anyone answers either yes or no without making necessary distinctions, both are not telling the truth. They're lying.
Father, we pray that your word will become a hammer that breaks rocks into pieces. That you will raise up in this nation pulpits and prophets that will call the nation back to repentance.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently, or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah initiative, conversation without compromise.
The thing that prompted this conversation that I wanted to have with you is I've seen a sentiment going around sort of social media quite a lot right now that because there are Christians in persecuted countries suffering under persecution, because that's happening, we in America should simply accept the lockdowns, accept the restrictions,
right.
And because people have it worse than us, therefore we shouldn't complain.
Right.
What you have some credentials on this and probably some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's overall general thinking behind, like, don't complain, just accept as it is, because we still have, better than worse places, that it's like, Turkmenistan or other North Korea, other places, and not to demand your rights. But even in Turkmenistan, like government says that we have constitutional rights to believe whatever we want to believe and have a freedom of religion, freedom of gathering, and everything. But in reality, it's not imposed by those who rule the country. We have a good laws in a sense that at least generally should provide the rights for churches and anybody to believe freely. And as a lawyer, I was fighting in the beginning actually against the breaking the law by those who rule, like a KGB or police or the local authorities trying to impose restrictions on believers. But they were always saying, actually, we have a law, but it's not for the citizens of this country. It's just for international community to show that we have these good laws, That's kind of a double standard. But I think in the U.S. is like getting into that notion is really, it's a mistake, because I think, if you start giving your rights, and it's in the Constitution of this country. I mean, U.S. especially, the founding fathers, it says that those rights were given by God, not like given by authority or some kind of man-made authority. But it's everybody is given rights from the Creator, to have the freedom and pursue happiness and live a free life. And now if we give this right to the government, then that's wrong. And I think it's going to create more issues, and we're going to give up more rights. And this country can turn into something, that third world country that violates a lot of freedoms of people.
So I'm curious to hear some of your kind of how you thought about this through the duration of the lockdowns. Because for those listening to this 350 years in the future, we're in the year 2020, and there has been immense lockdowns that have curbed every area of life, more or less. That's been businesses, that's been churches. Right now in Washington, churches are able to gather, but at 25% capacity, and we're not allowed to sing.
Wow.
Gatherings of more than 6 people outside of a house are prohibited, and the regulations have looked at different at different times, right? The start of the year, the start of the outbreak of COVID-19, churches were banned from gathering entirely because of the health risk of meeting in a large gathering. So how has this year been for you? What has your thinking changed throughout the year? Have you been like, don't tell me what to do from the beginning of the year?
Yeah, I mean, that was one. It was shocking that the government was like imposing those restrictions in US. I mean, compare still like some other countries. Still, we have some relatively more freedom than in Turkey. Even you have to have mask while you're driving. Like in Turkmenistan, if your like mask is down on your nose, then you will be penalized, stopped by police and state patrol and that kind of stuff. But still, I mean, I think when they started imposing restrictions, that was like, are we becoming like those countries where the government intentionally, openly violates the freedoms of their population, and they keep them under very tight control, and using police forces and other forces to impose those restrictions. And to be honest, it was like hard to accept, because I lived enough years under the most restrictive country. Like I was born and grew up in Turkmenistan, and then also lived in Russia a year. Experienced total government control of every part of your life. But then here, slowly, they started just a little bit, giving some restrictions, first recommending just wear the mask. Now they're restricting that even you can't gather as a family and friends for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and putting more and more restrictions is showing that the moment we agreed in one restriction, they're going to give more restrictions, and it's kind of a testing us and seeing how much they can take control of our lives, every level. That's why I think it was ups and downs for me and our family at times. Like when the second wave, I think here in Washington, when they said we're going to do another strict restrictions on gathering and church gatherings and even businesses and other things, I was like kind of mad.
Yeah.
First reaction. And it seems that what they're doing is not like legitimate. Definitely Bible says that we have to obey the local authorities and everything, but are they demanding the righteous demands, or following the righteous laws of the country or not? That's the issue for me, to find that balance.
So let's dig into this. So let's go to Romans 13, right? So Romans 13 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." So we have that, right? Both of us believe these are inspired words of God.
Right.
Yet we also went and ate at a restaurant right before this. We won't say which one.
Right.
So the question is, are we being hypocrites by kind of not taking this seriously, or is there something deeper going on? How do you think through this, right? You were, for those of you who haven't seen the last time Shura was on, Shura, was a lawyer by nature and profession back in Turkmenistan. He was one of the leaders of the persecuted church there, several times removed from the capital city for disobeying the government, and is probably still a wanted fugitive from the government of Turkmenistan.
Mm-hmm.
These words are true of the Turkmen government, they're true of the American government. How the heck do we apply this?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, like in Turkmenistan, for example, when they demanded us not to have any gatherings, any Christian gatherings, they called it like illegal gatherings. In order to gather according their understanding, was like you have to have a registration or government recognition. And then after that, when you have a registration with the government, then you can have church gatherings. But, then they created the restrictions on how to get the registration and the numbers of people that needs to be on the list. And then even though you had those lists, people on the list and all your documentations, they were not registering you. And then telling you that you're doing illegal gatherings. You see that the government is imposing unjustful, unrighteous laws, and then demanding to follow those laws. And in that sense, I think we need to follow God's law, and God's people needs to gather. They needs to encourage each other and worship God, and be in the Word and learn God's Word and preach the gospel, share the gospel with other people. And that's why we decided to continue, even though they each time raided our churches and house churches and arrested or kicked us out from the capital city. We tried to come back and do gatherings, obeying God's law. When the government breaks, I think, the God's law, and then I think we have a right to obey God rather than man. Like, apostles did the same thing.
Right.
In Jerusalem, they were, Peter and John was forbidden by Jewish authorities, but they said we have to rather follow God than man. I think same in this context. If we really breaking the law and doing bad things, then we have to be fearful. But if we're doing right things, but still government persecutes us or puts restrictions on us, then we should be obeying those not lawful injustice restrictions, I think.
Right. So what you're referencing is Acts 5:28. It says, Then Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men."
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of a basic cutting off point for us, is that there's things God has told us to do.
Right.
And we have to do those. And it doesn't matter. All the governments in the world tell us not to do them.
Yeah.
We have to keep doing them.
Right. In particular, I think based on the faith, like when the government tries to put those restrictions on the church, then I think that's totally wrong. They can recommend, they can, say that we have to be cautious and take care of our elderly and other things, recommend certain things, and allow church to decide, because we're not like, people that careless. We love our own communities and we love our neighbors, and we'll be careful. If somebody's sick, it will stay in their homes and different things. But when you try to put full restrictions on church, you can't gather for the certain amount, you can't sing, you can't do this and that, then it's like, I think it's coming to this point saying like we can't obey those restrictions, and we should listen to God and continue.
So one thing that keeps getting pointed out here is that, okay, well, these are public safety. These are for public safety, not persecution of the church. But I'm curious, what would the government of Turkmenistan use to justify the banning of church gatherings?
They say it's same. It's a public safety. They will use a kind of similar reasoning behind it, saying this is public safety where we can like protect everyone's cultural understanding. Our forefathers lived this way, and now we don't want to bring something new, and we don't allow Christian activities and this and that. That will be unacceptable for more public mind of people of this country, because we majority are Muslim. We traditionally, for our forefathers followed these, cultural rules and ways. Now you're bringing this new thing, and that's why we can't allow you to, openly have the same rights that other people have. That's the same similar reasoning. It's for the better of majority of people,
right?
For the safety and prosperity of this overall general Turkmen population. And if you bring, Christianity or some other things, then it's going to steer the boat, and people will be fighting each other. That can instigate some other, battles, and they can, hate each other, and they can kill each other. This, the reasoning is similar. You kind of, through your Christian activities, you kind of rock the boat, and you're not taking care of the general population or your neighbors and everyone.
Right, and that's the exact same thing I've heard from people who are operating in Gulf countries. Mm-hmm. Usually, from what I've heard, if a gathering of Christians gets broken up in Gulf countries, it's done very politely and very look, we're very sorry we have to do this. Mm-hmm. This is for your own good and well-being,
right?
And the well-being of society. Mm-hmm. Wish it didn't have to be this way, but it does.
Right.
Sorry, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Very rarely in history do you get somebody who says, I want people to worship me as God,
right?
Therefore, I'm going to persecute Christians for worshiping Jesus as God.
Yeah.
It's usually under the premise of public order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same. Yeah, even, I think, I know that the Romans' time, sometimes they blame something on Christians and others, and then that's used as a severe persecution. I think historically in church history that they burned Rome, some parts of Rome, and then they blamed Christians did it, and then they gave the order, massively persecute the Christians, and in the same way in some places, and that's why here also they may put more restrictions on us, saying we didn't follow the first restrictions, and because of that now more people are sick and this and that, and now we need to fully shut you down or something. I don't know, may come.
So one thing I noticed, right, and I think it's an important distinction, there is a difference between the law and the whims of a governing official. Mm-hmm. And that is a distinction that is very clear in the book of Acts. Mm-hmm. So in Acts chapter 16, it's in verse 28, it says, and when they brought them to the magistrates, they said, these men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city. There it is, right? Mm-hmm. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. Mm-hmm. The crowd joined together in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. When they inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into the prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safety. So the governing authorities are making an appeal to Roman law,
right?
But they're not actually
following the law.
Yeah. And you see Paul later weaponizes the law against them later in the narrative. And so when it was day, the magistrate sent the police saying, let those men go. The jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace. Mm-hmm. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So there, right? Again, it's not a disregard for the law.
Right.
Now, if it was illegal to preach the gospel, Paul would have still done it because we obey God rather than men.
Yeah.
But actually, there was no conflict between sharing the gospel and Roman law.
Right.
And Paul has absolutely no problem taking that and insisting that the governing magistrates obey the letters of Roman law when it gave them freedom to do so.
Yeah. Yeah. Same way. Yeah. That's why, like, I, as a lawyer and a believer and a pastor, I was demanding my rights, from Turkmen authorities, saying, like, Constitution, law, show me the article that I broke, by practicing my Christian faith. And they couldn't show anything, I wasn't breaking any law, written law, Constitution or any criminal law, anything. But as in this case, the ruling authority was making their own rules, and by that they were breaking the law of the country, my rights, and that's why, like, they couldn't do anything, but at the same time they were imposing restrictions without following, the Constitution or the general law of the country. In the same way, like Paul demanded, I don't know whether they, followed his demands in many cases. He still were persecuted, but it shows that he wasn't agreeing and or being silent when his rights were taken away or broken. And same here, I think, for the Christians, like, we can't say, okay, for the sake of obedience to the government, we can give up our rights. That will be wrong, and we don't see that precedent in the Bible. Wherever Paul had an opportunity, or the Peter and others, they were quoting their rights and demanding and their rights in front of authorities. When they didn't provide, they were still persecuting them. Then they still continued preaching the gospel and the gathering of the churches as a disobedient to the rules of those who rule in elite. But same time, they demanded whenever they needed, or they could. Same for us. I think it's like, I heard recently that there was a case taken to the Supreme Court by some Catholic churches and Jewish communities in New York, and the Supreme Court of the United States actually said that they have a right to exercise their freedom of religion and have gatherings without restrictions, and that, I think that's the correct way. If our rights are restricted or broken, then we should demand those rights, which is on the Constitution and the general law of this country. We have a freedom of religion and freedom of gatherings.
So I want to get onto more of that in a minute and kind of shift the tone of this, because even, well, you mentioned that, even Jesus in his trial, even he, when they strike him, he says, "Why was I hit? For what wrong was I struck for?"
Right.
And their answer is, "Would you talk to the high priest like that?"
Right.
And his response isn't, "Oh, defer to the high priest." It's, "If I've done wrong, tell me what it is."
Right. Yeah.
And so even though he knows he's going towards crucifixion and injustice, he still holds up the law as a standard to the people persecuting him as part of their kind of judgment and condemnation.
Right.
In that.
Yeah, and I think also like the hypocrisy of those who like rule or impose restrictions, on certain. They say like for everyone, but in reality, they come back and they don't demand those restrictions, or they don't impose those restrictions on certain type of people. That is kind of again serves their own agendas. Like in that case in Acts, they were breaking their own laws, but they wanted to appease the local community or something else, and they tried to impose restrictions because of that. Not because, the law demanded, but because of personal gains or personal, agenda of that magistrate or the local ruler. And in a lot of cases, I think in here in several states, I think that's the case. I mean, you don't see same restrictions are imposed for everyone, only to those who obey them, I think.
So, and that's it. This is what I'm noticing, right? That everyone has their own personal exemption to the rules at some point.
Right.
So people from the highest level to the lowest level who believe in lockdowns all have their own exception to lockdown at some point.
Right.
Right. Whether it's dinner with friends or getting your hair done, or whether it's this needs to happen, and there's hypocrisy, right?
Right.
So I've kind of after the so for me for the first probably 4 weeks I obeyed it fairly closely, except if I thought somebody really needed to see somebody.
Right.
Right. If I thought, okay, this person needs company and they're not going to do well if they don't, I'm willing to violate the law for the sake of the well-being of my friend. Right. And then after that, I just sort of started saying, okay, well, if people are young and healthy, then I'll interact with them. And then there's this 74-year-old Jewish guy. Well, he's not actually Jewish. He's culturally Jewish, right? It is kind of we talk about theology and philosophy a lot, and I hadn't been reaching out to him, and sort of hadn't tried to get together with him in person because he's at risk. But then when I finally saw him, I asked, well, there's a bit of a risk with us having this conversation. How do you feel about it? His response is, I'm 74. I'm ready to die. I'm not ready to spend the next year in my apartment.
Right.
And at that point, I thought, okay, there's this new social contract happening here where I am acknowledging a risk to myself and that my life is a risk to others, right? And they're doing the same thing as me. And we're deciding that the relationship and the face-to-face conversation is worth that risk.
Right.
But I realize that's not a new social contract. That is the exact social contract that has existed through all human history.
Right.
Like, doing anything in, say, Victorian London was far more risky than doing something even in the height of this right now, because disease and death have always been a part of life.
Yeah. I agree.
And I think, for me, there's always, being people who talk about Christianity and Islam in the Muslim world, there's sort of risk on the back burner of somebody getting really, really annoyed and trying to kill us is always kind of there, right?
Yeah.
Even in America.
Yeah.
But it's not very likely that anything would happen to us.
Right.
There's always the chance. But there's more risk for the people that we're doing ministry to.
Yeah. I mean, look at, I don't know, I think this even COVID thing, scientifically looking, I think it's a more kind of a fear-mongering people into this. Scientifically looking, I mean, they say it's 98% of people even contracting this virus is going to survive. Only less than a 2% is going to maybe, if they have some complications, they may die. How many people die in a car accident? How many people in the United States die in car accident? Are we going to put restrictions because, there's a risk of dying people, doing some, accident and dying or in injuring people. I'm driving. I may make a mistake or do something, then I may, injure somebody, or like I myself may die in a car accident. There's a risk always involved in life. Are we going to like restrict now everybody should not drive the car because of so many people dying because of the car accident? We don't do that. Same way here, I think it's not like 50% of those who can, get the COVID is dying left and right on the streets. People are dying. Then you can put those like maybe restrictions to save this population. But when it's like so low, and the risk level is so low, and then like making that excuse as restricting people and destroying people's like businesses and everything, and impacting every level of your life, as your social life, you can't visit your friends, you can't be face to face, your kids are in school, not in school, not developing those social skills and different things. I think that's not right. And we can't live like with the fear every day that I may die or I may get this and that. As you said, historically people lived much worse scenarios and situations, but they continued their lives, and they overcame those challenges of lives. I think same here. I think we have to follow. Again, give the freedom of choice. Yeah, definitely government can recommend, advise, help them in every level, but putting the restrictions on people and deciding for people, is not going to work, I think.
And I think part of the problem is that so many people buy into this idea of the sort of neutrality of worldview. Right, and people don't realize that, they look at, say, communist China or Turkmenistan or somewhere where there's, or Pakistan where there's persecution of Christians and think, okay, well that's because they have a different religion and they're then imposing that religion on other people. But that's still happening here because what you have is essentially a secular worldview governing society. That when a crisis comes, they say, okay, well, we're completely fine believing in your imaginary God when everything's going fine, right? But things are serious now, and serious people need to be in charge of things, and that is not you. And you need to listen to us, and you can partake in your delusions when we say you can partake in your delusions, right?
Yes, yeah.
That is fundamentally what is going on, right? And it is not that they're not thinking that directly. That is functionally what happens.
Right, yeah. That's correct.
So ultimately, as Christians, we think about life differently, right? Living as long as we possibly can is not necessarily the ultimate goal.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think another thing is that they try to shame you, in those cultures, like in Turkmenistan and other places, they use a shame. And not necessarily you breaking the law, but they try to use, shaming you, making you feel like, you're irresponsible. Then because of that, you have to follow the restrictions. Here it's the same way. If you don't follow our restrictions, then they try to shame you and make you guilty of like, oh, you don't care enough for your neighbors and others. That's why you don't listen to our restrictions. But Christian communities been known throughout history, even in worse scenarios and sicknesses, and they've been the ones that were taking care of the needy most of the time, even like orphanages and different things, throughout the history in Europe and other places. They were like, when mainly the governments and elite of societies were neglecting the needs of the people. The church was meeting their needs and taking care of those needy people and serving them and loving them. And I think even looking back to the history of Christianity, I think the governments shouldn't be they shouldn't try to guilt, give a, what they call it, shame them or try to guilt trip them, to obey the restrictions. We genuinely, usually Christians always cautious, and they help the needy and take care of the unhealthy or sick and that kind of stuff. That's why I think we're gonna do better job without even government putting restrictions on Christians and churches.
Right. Right. And I think what we need to talk about is, so we've got these principles, right? We've got obey God rather than man. If when the law is righteous and the leaders disobey it, we hold them to the standard of the law.
Right.
And we have to keep doing our work regardless of restrictions.
Right.
How do people resist? How should Christians resist unjust governments, unjust laws, worldviews that oppose us?
I think it's like by civil disobedience. We're not gonna, we can't fight. In some cases, I mean, if government is really, like, I think in Germany, some Christians decided to join the resistance and fight unjust government that was killing people and bringing a lot of destruction and hardships on people. They were like joining, to armed resistance and different things. But I think first of all, we can like do civil disobedience, like, in cases of even John and Peter and even, Apostle Paul and others, they did, civil disobedience. They said, we're going to rather obey God and lawful laws than, the opinions and restrictions of the dictators. And I think that's how we can do from kind of first stage. I mean, what I can think right now, and continue what God entrusted us to do.
And I think right now we have this unique opportunity because the law is very favorable to us at this point.
Yeah.
Like, doing civil disobedience in, say, Saudi Arabia, you're going to have a harder time than doing it here.
Right.
Because very likely, when all the cards are fallen, you'll be vindicated not just by God, but by the law itself, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, even in like doing civil disobedience, I mean, for our case, it was like we were not obedient to the demands of the government back in Turkmenistan. They said, don't gather, don't have a house church, don't preach, don't convert Turkmen into Christianity. And we said, we're not going to obey that demand. And we're going to continue. And then as I continued, then they started persecuting, arresting, torturing, trying to kill us. And that's a way that the government may respond. They may imprison you, they may, use other illegal ways to stop that disobedience, kind of. And here, I mean, some churches like decided, I think it's John MacArthur's church and several other churches in California, they decided to disobey that demand, those restrictions, and continue. And because of that, they were given penalties now. If you do that, then you will penalize, money-wise or different other ways, or they may come and, I saw, I think, a couple of pastors were arrested and that kind of stuff. I mean, this is already taking place, I think, in the United States, and how far is government is willing to go against that. I don't know.
I got lunch with a guy last month who was arrested in Idaho because they did a sort of mask mandate there, and to peacefully protest, a bunch of the Christians showed up in the city hall and sort of sang songs, and they arrested this guy and then eventually released him. But that went so badly for them that they just left everyone alone since then.
Right.
And it didn't go badly because people were rioting and looting. It went badly because they were just sort of getting a lot of civil public pressure of, look, we love you guys. We believe in your role as the governing authorities, but this is unacceptable.
Right.
You should be ashamed of doing this to citizens.
Yeah.
And the government capitulated.
Right.
And now you walk through this town, about a third of it feels completely free, and the rest of it feels like
they're restricted.
Washington.
Right. Yeah.
Because churches were actually willing to sort of stand up and actually say something about it.
Yeah. I think same. I think if people don't demand their rights and stand against those kind of restrictions, and they can impose more and more restrictions on people. I think even in it's interesting that another case in New York, the guy Jim was like, they tried to impose restrictions and he didn't listen, disobeyed that, and they penalized him $15,000 penalty, and he ripped it out, but he put the sign on his door saying autonomous zone,
Yeah.
What's the autonomous zone here in Seattle, and then they could do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
And then they were not restricted.
Nope.
Certain people, not restricted, but those who obey, they're restricted more. And those people that obey usually are suffering.
Yeah.
Those businesses that followed first restrictions, the little requirements and this and that, most of them lost their businesses and livelihood, and now second restriction is also impacting a lot of people's lives.
Coming back for the ones they missed.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about. We're about to go to the after show, but I want to talk about a little bit of the argument of seeking your rights and your freedom is selfishness, whereas accepting these things is selflessness. But for that, you have to join us on the after show. So thank you for being here, and thank you for listening to the Almeida Initiative podcast. We will be back next week. Please like and subscribe for more content every Wednesday. It helps more people see these videos and join in this important conversation. If you want to see more of this conversation, check out the after show right here, or you can watch last week's episode.
This British guy customer is really hot. Can you bring me some water? على فكرة احنا اسمنا المائدة يا اخي، جيبونا اكل حاجة، جيبونا تميز فول يا هو.